Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Millfield, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1895, and the Industrial Revolution had transformed the quiet mill town of Millfield, Massachusetts, into a prosperous textile manufacturing center. The red brick factories stood tall along the Blackstone River, their smokestacks belching dark clouds into the otherwise pristine New England sky. It was within this backdrop of progress and industry that the peculiar case of Laura Whitaker began to unfold. Laura Whitaker was 32 years old when she vanished from her home on Willow Street. She was known throughout town as a reserved but pleasant woman who had inherited a considerable fortune after her husband Thomas Whitaker, a prominent mill owner, passed away under what some considered unusual circumstances 3 years prior. The official cause was listed as heart failure, though whispers suggested otherwise. Laura lived alone in their Victorian mansion at the edge of town, rarely entertaining visitors and maintaining a modest lifestyle despite her wealth. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not simply that Laura disappeared, but rather what was discovered in her absence. Sheriff James Morton was called to the Whitaker estate on October 17, 1895, after Laura's housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Pearson, arrived to find the front door slightly ajar. According to the police report filed that day, nothing in the house appeared disturbed. Laura's belongings remained in place. Her evening tea sat cold on the side table in the parlor. The only peculiar detail was a single chair pulled to the center of the dining room, facing the large bay window that overlooked the garden. On that chair lay Laura's journal, open to a blank page. The residents of Millfield initially believed Laura had simply taken an unannounced trip, perhaps to visit distant relatives or to seek respite at a coastal resort, as was fashionable among ladies of means during that era. But as days turned to weeks and her banking accounts remained untouched, concern grew among those who knew her. Mrs. Pearson insisted something was terribly wrong. Miss Laura would never leave without proper arrangements for the house, she told the local newspaper, the Millfield Gazette. And she certainly wouldn't abandon her correspondence. Indeed, Laura's meticulous nature was well documented. Her personal letters, now preserved in the Millfield Historical Society archives, reveal a woman of careful habits and precise routines. She wrote daily entries in her journal, maintained detailed household accounts, and corresponded regularly with a small circle of acquaintances. The sudden cessation of these activities seemed entirely out of character. What few people knew about Laura Whitaker was that beneath her quiet demeanor lay a sharp, observant mind. Following her husband's death, she had taken an unusual interest in the operations of his textile mill, requesting financial records and production reports from the manager, Edwin Porter. This was considered highly irregular for a woman in 1890s New England, and caused significant discomfort among the business partners who had worked with her late husband. According to town records, Laura had even attended several board meetings, sitting silently in the corner, taking notes in a small leather-bound notebook. The weather that autumn had been unusually cold and damp, with fog rolling in from the river most evenings, shrouding the town in a ghostly mist. The Whitaker mansion, with its steep gables and ornate ironwork, stood partially obscured by ancient oak trees at the end of a winding gravel drive. Locals would later report that in the weeks before Laura's disappearance, lights could be seen moving from window to window late into the night, as though someone was restlessly pacing the halls of the grand house. Sheriff Morton's initial investigation yielded few leads. No signs of struggle were evident within the home, no blood, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest Laura had left against her will. Her clothing appeared undisturbed, her jewelry box still contained valuable pieces, and a considerable amount of cash remained in the household safe. It was as though she had simply stepped out for a moment and vanished into the autumn air. The only potential witness was Frederick Simmons, the elderly gardener who tended the grounds 3 times weekly. Simmons reported seeing a black carriage without markings parked near the service entrance of the property on the evening before Laura was reported missing. "Weren't no one I recognized," he stated in his official testimony. Driver kept his hat low. Didn't see no passenger neither. When pressed for more details, the gardener could only add that the horses were unusually fine specimens, the kind that cost more than a working man sees in a year. The Whitaker residence itself seemed to hold clues that investigators of the time may have overlooked. The mansion, built in 1872 during the height of Thomas Whitaker's business success, was a 3-story Victorian structure with numerous architectural peculiarities. Hidden passages connected certain rooms, ostensibly for servants to move through the house unseen. A dumbwaiter system allowed items to be transported between floors without using the main staircases. The basement contained a wine cellar with a curiously sturdy door, secured with multiple locks that seemed excessive for mere bottles of vintage port. Mrs. Pearson, during subsequent interviews, mentioned that Laura rarely ventured into certain parts of the house, particularly the third-floor rooms that had once been Thomas's private study and adjacent smoking room. She said the air up there felt wrong, the housekeeper recalled. Said it made her head spin something terrible whenever she tried to sort through his papers. This aversion had begun shortly after Thomas's death and persisted until Laura's disappearance. As October gave way to November, the case took an unexpected turn when a package arrived at the sheriff's office. Inside was Laura's journal, not the one found on the chair, but an earlier volume dating from immediately after her husband's death until approximately 6 months before her disappearance. The package bore no return address and had been mailed from Boston, some 50 miles away. The handwriting on the label was determined not to be Laura's. The contents of this journal revealed a woman increasingly troubled by suspicions regarding her husband's business affairs and the circumstances of his death. Laura wrote of discovering financial discrepancies in the mill's accounts, of overhearing hushed conversations that ceased when she entered a room, and of a growing sense that she was being observed in her own home. "I feel eyes upon me even now as I write these words," one entry read. The house creaks and sighs as though it wishes to speak of what it has witnessed. Most disturbing were Laura's references to a locked room in the mill's administrative building, one to which she had been denied access despite her position as owner's widow. "Mr. Porter insists the room contains only outdated equipment and damaged merchandise," she wrote. "Yet I have observed him and Mr. Holloway entering late in the evening, carrying documents which they take great care to conceal." An entry dated January 18, 1895, described a particularly troubling incident. "Today I found among Thomas's effects a key I had not seen before, small and oddly shaped, with an unusual double-toothed design. When I mentioned it to Mr. Porter during our meeting regarding the quarterly accounts, his face changed in such a manner that I immediately regretted speaking of it. He asked to see this key, claiming it might open a storage cabinet containing important company records. I told him I would look for it again, but in truth I have secured it in a place known only to myself." Something in his expression warned me against trusting him with this discovery. Laura's journal entries became increasingly erratic as the months progressed, some containing crossing out and rewritings, others featuring margins filled with hastily scribbled notes or questions. In March 1895, she wrote of experiencing dizzy spells and moments of confusion. "I found myself in the garden today, with no recollection of having left the house." Mrs. Pearson was quite concerned, said I had been missing for nearly an hour. My gloves were damp with dew, though I do not recall putting them on. By April, Laura had begun to suspect she was being poisoned. "The tea tastes different when Dr. Reynolds visits. The bitterness lingers, and always after, the room seems to tilt and sway, voices becoming distant and unclear. I have begun to dispose of any food or drink served when others are present. Mrs. Pearson believes me becoming eccentric, but I dare not share my suspicions even with her. Who can I trust when the walls themselves may have ears? Sheriff Morton, upon reading these entries, immediately dispatched deputies to investigate the mill. They discovered the room in question had been recently emptied and thoroughly cleaned with lye soap, according to the building's custodian. Edwin Porter, when questioned about this room, claimed it had merely housed confidential business records and prototype designs for new textile patterns. The hasty cleaning, he explained, was simply part of a larger effort to reorganize the administrative offices. The investigation might have ended there, relegated to the status of an unsolved disappearance, had it not been for the curiosity of Harriet Blackwood, a journalist from the neighboring city of Worcester. Blackwood had developed a reputation for investigating cases that local authorities seemed eager to abandon, particularly those involving women. She arrived in Millfield in early December 1895, taking a room at the Riverside Inn and introducing herself as a distant cousin of Laura's, come to settle affairs. Blackwood's private notes, later published in the Worcester Daily Telegram, detail her methodical approach to unraveling the mystery. She began by interviewing Mrs. Pearson, the housekeeper, who revealed that Laura had been suffering from headaches and episodes of confusion in the weeks before her disappearance. She would sometimes stop mid-sentence, as though she'd forgotten what she meant to say, Pearson recalled, and once I found her standing in the hallway, staring at the wallpaper, claiming the pattern had changed overnight. These symptoms, coupled with Laura's documented paranoia in her journal, might suggest a deteriorating mental state, perhaps even the onset of a nervous condition. However, Blackwood's investigation uncovered a far more sinister possibility. Through careful questioning of the household staff and local pharmacist, she learned that Laura received regular deliveries of a tonic prescribed by Dr. Malcolm Reynolds, a physician who had also attended to her late husband. Pharmaceutical records from the period indicate this tonic likely contained significant amounts of arsenic compounds, commonly prescribed for everything from digestive ailments to skin conditions. In small doses, arsenic was considered medicinal. In larger amounts, administered over time, it produced symptoms remarkably similar to those Laura had exhibited: headaches, confusion, paranoia, and eventually heart failure, the very cause attributed to Thomas Whitaker's death. Dr. Reynolds, when approached by Blackwood under the pretense of seeking treatment for nervous exhaustion, was described as a man of austere bearing with cold, assessing eyes. His office, located on the ground floor of his imposing brick home on Maple Street, was decorated with medical diplomas from prestigious institutions and anatomical drawings that Blackwood found unnecessarily detailed and somewhat disturbing in their precision. Reynolds was reluctant to discuss Laura Whitaker's case, citing patient confidentiality, but did remark that she had exhibited troubling signs of feminine hysteria and delusional thinking following her husband's death. Records at the Millfield County Clerk's office revealed that Reynolds had been among the first investors in Thomas Whitaker's textile enterprise 20 years earlier. He served on the company's board of directors and held a significant number of shares, information that he had neglected to mention during his conversation with Blackwood. This connection raised questions about potential conflicts of interest in his treatment of both Thomas and Laura Whitaker. The winter of 1895-96 was particularly harsh in New England. Snow piled against the windows of the empty Whitaker mansion, and ice formed intricate patterns on the glass, like ghostly fingers reaching inward. The investigation stalled as roads became impassable, and the town's attention turned to more immediate concerns of survival through the bitter cold months. During this period, Blackwood focused her attention on researching Thomas Whitaker's death. Death certificates filed with the town clerk indicated he had suffered from declining health for approximately 6 months before his passing, with symptoms including fatigue, confusion, and digestive disturbances. Dr. Reynolds had attended him throughout and signed the final certificate attributing death to heart failure. No autopsy had been performed, as was common for individuals of Whitaker's social standing who died under a doctor's care. The funeral had been conducted with unusual haste, with burial occurring just 2 days after death, a timeline that, while not unprecedented in the era before modern embalming techniques, was nonetheless rushed for a man of Whitaker's prominence in the community. Through discreet inquiries among domestic staff who had been employed at the Whitaker household during Thomas's final illness, Blackwood uncovered a pattern that matched Laura's later experiences. Thomas had initially expressed concerns about business irregularities at the mill, particularly regarding financial transactions authorized by Edwin Porter that seemed excessive or improperly documented. Shortly thereafter, he began experiencing health problems that gradually worsened despite Dr. Reynolds's regular attendance and prescribed treatments. When spring finally arrived, bringing with it the thaw, it also brought an unexpected discovery. A group of children playing near the river found a woman's boot caught among rocks at the water's edge. The item was identified as belonging to Laura Whitaker, of the same style and size she was known to wear. Sheriff Morton organized a search of the riverbanks, but rising waters from spring rains made thorough investigation impossible. Some in town suggested that Laura had taken her own life, overcome by grief or mental instability, and that the river had finally yielded evidence of her fate. The discovery of the boot sparked renewed interest in the case among townspeople. Memorial services were held at the Millfield Congregational Church, where Laura had occasionally attended Sunday services. Edwin Porter spoke eloquently about her delicate constitution and the tragedy of a mind unbalanced by grief. Dr. Reynolds nodded solemnly throughout the proceedings. Neither man mentioned Laura's growing involvement in business affairs or her questions about financial irregularities. Harriet Blackwood remained unconvinced. In April 1896, she managed to gain access to the Whitaker mansion, which had remained unoccupied since Laura's disappearance. The house had begun to show signs of neglect. Dust covered the furniture, and damp had begun to seep into the walls of the less-used rooms. Among Laura's possessions, Blackwood discovered something overlooked in the initial investigation: a hidden compartment in Laura's writing desk, containing correspondence between Laura and a lawyer in Boston named Jonathan Hayes. The letters revealed that Laura had been preparing to file legal documents challenging the management of her late husband's business affairs. She had compiled evidence of financial improprieties involving Edwin Porter and several board members, including Dr. Reynolds. More alarmingly, she had begun to suspect that her husband's death had been deliberately induced to prevent him from exposing these irregularities. "I believe Thomas discovered their scheme," Laura wrote, "and paid the ultimate price for his integrity. Now they administer the same slow poison to me, thinking a woman would never recognize the symptoms." Laura's final letter to Hayes, dated just 3 days before her disappearance, stated her intention to travel to Boston the following week to finalize the legal proceedings. "I have removed the evidence from the house," she wrote, "as I no longer feel secure even within these walls. Should anything happen to me before our meeting, you will find everything you need in the place we discussed." The correspondence also contained references to a Mr. Sullivan, who had provided Laura with information about the mill's operations. This individual was described only as someone who works within but sees all with clear eyes. His identity remained unclear, but the implication was that Laura had found an ally among the mill employees who was helping her gather evidence of wrongdoing. Most revealing was a fragment of what appeared to be a financial ledger, carefully copied in Laura's precise handwriting. The figures showed substantial sums being diverted from the mill's accounts into something called Project Cerberus, with annotations suggesting these transactions had been concealed through a system of false invoices and manipulated production reports. Next to these figures, Laura had written, "The same pattern appears in the quarterly reports for the past 4 years, beginning shortly before Thomas first expressed concerns about the company's financial health." Blackwood took this information to Sheriff Morton, who appeared troubled by the revelations, but hesitant to pursue them. "There are powerful men implicated here," he reportedly told her, "men who employ half the town. Without concrete evidence, these accusations could destroy livelihoods. The sheriff's reluctance only fueled Blackwood's determination. She traveled to Boston to meet with Jonathan Hayes, only to discover he had abruptly closed his practice and relocated to Chicago several months earlier. His former clerk, however, remembered Laura Whitaker and confirmed she had indeed consulted Hayes regarding suspicious business practices at her late husband's mill. The clerk had no knowledge of any place where evidence might have been hidden. While in Boston, Blackwood visited the city's main post office, showing Laura's photograph to clerks who might have observed her mailing the package containing her journal to the Millfield sheriff. One elderly postal worker recalled a woman matching Laura's description who had seemed unusually anxious when sending a package in late October. She kept looking over her shoulder, he noted, as though expecting someone to appear behind her. Returning to Millfield, Blackwood found herself increasingly unwelcome. Her room at the inn was suddenly no longer available. Local establishments became reluctant to serve her, and she noted being followed by unknown men during her daily investigations. She relocated to Worcester, but continued her inquiries through correspondence with Mrs. Pearson, who remained one of the few allies in the search for truth about Laura's fate. In a letter dated May 28, 1896, Mrs. Pearson wrote to Blackwood about strange occurrences at the Whitaker mansion. "Twice now I have gone to check on the house, as requested by Mr. Porter, until the estate is settled, and found small things disturbed. A book moved from its shelf to the table, a curtain tied back that I distinctly remember leaving drawn. Yesterday I discovered footprints in the dust on the stairs leading to the third floor, Thomas's old rooms that Laura avoided. When I mentioned these oddities to Mr. Porter, he suggested it was merely my imagination, or perhaps local boys breaking in for mischief, but the house remains locked, Miss Blackwood, and no windows have been forced." In late summer 1896, nearly a year after Laura's disappearance, a fire broke out at the mill's administrative building. The blaze, attributed to faulty electrical wiring, destroyed the offices and most of the records contained within. Edwin Porter, in comments to the Millfield Gazette, lamented the tragic accident, but assured the community that the mill would rebuild and operations would continue with minimal disruption. The timing of the fire raised suspicions for those still interested in Laura's case. Harriet Blackwood published a series of articles questioning whether important evidence had been destroyed intentionally. These accusations drew a swift response from Porter's attorneys, who threatened legal action for defamation. The Worcester Daily Telegram, facing potential litigation, discontinued Blackwood's investigative series and reassigned her to cover society events. The night watchman, who had been on duty when the fire began, provided a contradictory account to the official explanation. In a sworn statement to insurance investigators, he claimed to have observed two men entering the administrative building after hours, shortly before the first signs of smoke became visible. His testimony was ultimately dismissed due to inconsistencies, and he was terminated from his position for dereliction of duty in failing to prevent the fire. What happened next is documented primarily through personal correspondence between Blackwood and Elizabeth Stanton, a prominent women's rights activist of the era. In these letters, preserved in the Seneca Falls Women's History Archive, Blackwood describes receiving an anonymous note directing her to a small boarding house in South Boston. There she found an elderly woman named Margaret Walsh, who claimed to have been hired as a private nurse in October 1895. According to Walsh's account, she was engaged to care for a female patient suffering from nervous exhaustion at a private residence outside the city. The patient, whom she knew only as Mrs. Smith, was kept sedated with laudanum and rarely fully conscious. Walsh described her as a slender woman in her early 30s with auburn hair, a description matching Laura Whitaker. After approximately 2 weeks, Walsh arrived for her shift to find the house empty. The patient, the doctor who had hired her, and all personal belongings had vanished. She was paid her final wages by messenger the following day, with a stern warning to forget the entire arrangement. Walsh could not recall the exact location of the house, having been transported there in a closed carriage with the curtains drawn. She did remember it was near the coast, as she could hear foghorns from ships in the harbor on misty nights. She also recalled distinctive iron gates at the entrance to the property, worked into the pattern of intertwined snakes, a detail that caused Blackwood's blood to run cold. The Whitaker family crest, displayed above the entrance to their Millfield mansion, featured two serpents entwined around a central pillar. Walsh provided additional details that lent credibility to her account. The patient sometimes spoke when the sedation began to wear off, mentioning a name that sounded like Thomas, and asking repeatedly about papers and evidence. On one occasion, the woman had become agitated, grasping Walsh's hand and whispering, "They're poisoning me slowly, just as they did him." This testimony suggested a coordinated effort to remove Laura from Millfield and keep her isolated until whatever plans her husband's former associates had set in motion could be completed without her interference. The doctor who had hired her was tall and thin, with a prominent nose and cold manner, a description consistent with Dr. Reynolds. The discovery of her boot by the river months later may have been staged to support a narrative of suicide and discourage further investigation. Blackwood attempted to bring this new information to authorities in both Boston and Millfield, but found little interest in pursuing the case. Too much time had elapsed, the witness testimony was deemed unreliable, and powerful interests seemed determined to maintain the official version of events, that Laura Whitaker had either taken her own life or left town of her own accord. A search of properties along the Massachusetts coast that featured gates with serpent motifs proved fruitless. Many estates had changed hands since 1895, and architectural details had been modified or replaced. The trail grew increasingly cold as months passed without new developments. By 1897, the Whitaker mansion had been sold to a newcomer to Millfield, a business associate of Edwin Porter named Howard Granville. The mill continued operations under Porter's management, expanding its production capacity and workforce. Dr. Reynolds retired to Florida, citing health concerns, and the mysterious case of Laura Whitaker faded from public consciousness, becoming little more than a whispered story told on dark nights. Harriet Blackwood never abandoned her investigation, though opportunities to pursue it actively diminished as years passed. Her personal journals, maintained until her death in 1941, contain scattered references to the case and occasional notes about new information or potential leads. She remained convinced that Laura had been the victim of a conspiracy to silence her and seize control of her husband's business interests, a conspiracy that likely included her husband's murder by slow poisoning. In 1899, Blackwood received a letter from Margaret Walsh containing a curious postscript. The nurse had recently been cleaning out old belongings and discovered a small item she had forgotten, a handkerchief belonging to the mysterious patient she had tended in 1895. The delicate linen square bore embroidered initials. L.W. Blackwood considered this physical evidence, confirming Laura Whitaker's identity as Walsh's patient, but authorities still declined to reopen the investigation based on such limited evidence. The Millfield textile mill prospered in the early years of the 20th century. Edwin Porter became one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts, expanding his business interests to include railroad investments and banking. He died in 1922 of natural causes, remembered as a pillar of the community and generous philanthropist. His obituary in the Millfield Gazette made no mention of the Whitaker family or the circumstances under which he had assumed control of the mill. In the summer of 1908, 13 years after Laura's disappearance, a woman matching her description was reportedly seen in a small fishing village on the Maine coast. A local shopkeeper claimed this woman had inquired about boats heading to Nova Scotia and seemed nervous, always looking over her shoulder. By the time Blackwood learned of this sighting and traveled to investigate, the woman had departed, leaving no trail. The most significant development came in 1915, when a groundskeeper at the Millfield Cemetery reported finding fresh flowers placed on Thomas Whitaker's grave on the anniversary of his death. This continued for 3 consecutive years, always occurring before dawn when no visitors were observed entering the grounds. The flowers, white lilies, had been Thomas's favorite, according to former household staff. The caretaker installed a primitive alarm system of bells on the cemetery gates, but the mysterious visitor was never caught, and the flowers ceased appearing after 1918. Howard Granville, who had purchased the Whitaker mansion, reported unusual occurrences in the house throughout his residence there. Doors would be found open that had been closed the night before. Items disappeared only to reappear in different locations days later. Most disturbing were the sounds, soft footsteps on the 3rd floor when no one was there, and occasional sobbing that seemed to come from within the walls. Granville eventually sold the property in 1920, moving his family to Boston and refusing to discuss his reasons for leaving Millfield. In one of her final entries regarding the case, dated 1925, Blackwood wrote, "I visited Millfield today for the first time in many years. The town has grown, the mill expanded beyond recognition. Few remember the Whitaker name now. I stood for a long while outside the old mansion, now divided into apartments for the mill's supervisory staff. I felt her presence still, a woman who saw too clearly and asked too many questions in an age when women were expected to see and know nothing beyond their domestic concerns. Perhaps that was her true crime." Blackwood's own life bore the mark of her investigation. Her pursuit of Laura Whitaker's case had cost her professionally, as many publications became reluctant to employ a journalist who had developed a reputation for controversial investigations and challenging powerful interests. She never married, dedicating herself instead to documenting cases of women who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances throughout New England, women whose stories might otherwise have been forgotten. In her later years, Blackwood compiled her research into a manuscript titled Silenced: The Untold Stories of Missing Women. Publishers rejected the work as too sensational and potentially libelous, despite Blackwood's meticulous documentation. After her death, the manuscript was donated to the Worcester Historical Society, where it remained largely unexamined until feminist scholars rediscovered it in the 1970s. The most unsettling postscript to this case emerged in 1958, when renovations at the former Whitaker Mill, by then converted to office space, revealed a sealed wall cavity containing a small metal box. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with Laura Whitaker's distinctive handwriting. The book contained detailed financial records, names, dates, and descriptions of what appeared to be an elaborate embezzlement scheme involving Edwin Porter and several other prominent businessmen of 1890s Millfield. The records detailed how funds from the mill had been diverted to finance a separate venture called Cerberus Manufacturing, which produced textile machinery using designs stolen from competitors and modifications developed in the Whitaker Mill's workshops. This operation allowed Porter and his associates to profit twice, once from the mill's legitimate business, and again from selling the machinery back to the industry at inflated prices. The documentation suggested that nearly 30% of the mill's reported profits had been siphoned into this parallel enterprise over a period of 5 years. Most damning were the entries connecting Dr. Reynolds to the scheme. As both a business partner and physician, he had used his dual role to silence potential opposition. When Thomas Whitaker began questioning certain financial transactions, Reynolds had administered increasing doses of arsenic under the guise of treating digestive complaints. Laura had documented symptoms and doses with clinical precision, having recognized the pattern from medical texts she had studied in secret. The final entry, dated October 16, 1895, the day before Laura was reported missing, read simply, "They know that I know. I hear them now on the stairs. Whatever happens, the truth must survive." The notebook was submitted to the Massachusetts State Police as potential evidence in a 60-year-old missing persons case. After brief examination, it was forwarded to the state archives, where it was cataloged and stored. No further investigation was pursued. The statute of limitations for any crimes committed had long expired, and all parties involved were presumed deceased. In 1962, a Massachusetts Historical Society researcher looking into industrial development in the Blackstone Valley requested access to the notebook. Officials at the state archives were unable to locate it. Subsequent requests over the following decades met with the same response. The final piece of evidence in the Laura Whitaker case had vanished once again, as completely as Laura herself. The Whitaker mill buildings were demolished in 1968 to make way for a modern shopping complex. During excavation, workers uncovered a section of old foundation containing what appeared to be a small room, not shown on any architectural plans. The space, roughly 6 feet square, contained no windows and only one heavy door reinforced with iron bands. The walls bore scratch marks near the base, as though made by fingernails or some small implement. Construction was briefly halted while county officials investigated, but with no historical context provided by the site developers, the discovery was dismissed as an old storage room or possibly a secure area for valuable manufacturing materials. One worker, however, reported finding a small object embedded in the mortar between stones, a locket containing a miniature portrait of a woman with auburn hair and serious eyes. The item disappeared from the construction site before authorities could examine it, and the worker later recanted his story when questioned by local newspaper reporters. The construction continued without further interruption. In the early 1980s, during renovations to the Millfield Public Library, a collection of documents was discovered, tucked behind a loose panel in the reference section. Among these papers were several pages of what appeared to be Harriet Blackwood's correspondence that had never been included in her archived materials. Most significantly, there was a letter addressed to future investigators dated 1938, 3 years before Blackwood's death. In this document, Blackwood claimed to have finally located Laura Whitaker in 1927, more than 30 years after her disappearance. According to this account, Laura had escaped from the house where she was being held and fled to Canada, then to England, living under assumed names and in constant fear of being discovered. She had attempted to build evidence against those who had conspired against her, but found herself branded as mentally unstable whenever she approached authorities. "I met with her in a small cottage on the Cornwall coast," Blackwood wrote. "She was much altered by time and hardship, her hair gone white, her once steady hands now trembling, but her mind remained sharp, her memory intact. She showed me documents she had managed to preserve, copies of those she had hidden years before. The originals, she believed, had been discovered and destroyed. She lived in isolation, venturing out rarely, convinced that even after all this time, those who had once silenced her would do so permanently if they knew she still lived." The veracity of this letter has been questioned by historians and researchers. No travel records exist confirming Blackwood's journey to England in 1927, and the paper and ink of the document have never been authoritatively dated. Some suggest it may be a literary fabrication, perhaps created by someone who had read Blackwood's unpublished manuscript and wished to provide the case with a more satisfying resolution. Others believe it represents Blackwood's final attempt to bring attention to a case that had defined her professional life and that she had never been able to solve to her satisfaction. Today, the location where Laura Whitaker lived and possibly died gives no indication of the events that transpired there. The shopping complex stands busy and bright. The river runs clearer now that the mills no longer dump their waste into its waters, and the residents of modern Millfield go about their lives unaware of the woman who once sought to expose corruption and paid an unknown price for her courage. The last known reference to Laura Whitaker in official records comes from a 1930 amendment to the deed of her former property. A small corner of the estate's garden was designated as protected land, never to be built upon or altered. The document bears the signature of a Boston attorney acting on behalf of an anonymous benefactor. This protected area contained a single oak tree, beneath which, local legend claimed, Laura had often sat to read on summer afternoons. The tree still stands today, now surrounded by a parking lot, its significance forgotten by most. Occasionally, visitors to the site report a strange phenomenon, the sensation of being watched by someone standing beneath the ancient oak, particularly on foggy autumn evenings. Security cameras have captured unexplained shadows moving around the tree when no physical presence is visible. Maintenance workers avoid the area after dark, claiming the air there feels heavy and hard to breathe. Some questions remain unanswered. Was Laura Whitaker murdered to prevent her from exposing financial crimes? Was she institutionalized somewhere under a false identity, kept drugged and isolated, until her legitimate claims could be dismissed as the ravings of a mentally unstable woman? Or did she perhaps escape the fate intended for her, disappearing deliberately with the evidence she had gathered, waiting for a moment that never came when justice might be possible? The truth lies buried beneath layers of time, deliberate obfuscation, and the convenient arrangements of power. What remains undisputed is that a woman who challenged the established order vanished without trace, and those who stood to lose the most from her revelations prospered in her absence. In that cold equation lies perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this century-old mystery. Not that we cannot know with certainty what happened to Laura Whitaker, but that so few with the authority to investigate truly wanted to know. Visitors to Millfield's historical cemetery sometimes leave flowers at the empty plot bearing the Whitaker name. The gravestone for Thomas shows his dates of birth and death. Beside it stands a smaller marker for Laura, bearing only her name and a date of birth, the date of death left conspicuously blank, an unintentional testament to a mystery never resolved. A photograph exists in the Millfield Historical Society archives, taken at a company gathering circa 1892. It shows Thomas Whitaker standing among his business associates, including Edwin Porter and Dr. Reynolds. In the background, partially obscured but still visible, stands Laura, her expression, not the vacant smile expected of a businessman's wife at such functions, but a gaze of focused assessment, already observing the men who would later become the objects of her investigation. Perhaps in that moment, watching her husband's declining health and the whispered conversations among his colleagues, the seeds of suspicion were already taking root. And on particularly quiet nights, staff at the shopping center, built over the foundations of the old mill, sometimes report hearing what sounds like scratching coming from inside the walls, soft but persistent, like someone trying very hard to get out. Maintenance checks reveal nothing, and the sounds are attributed to old pipes or settling concrete. But those who have heard it describe an unsettling sensation that accompanies the sound, a feeling of being watched by eyes filled with urgent purpose and terrible knowledge. In 1997, during installation of new electrical systems at the shopping center, workers broke through a section of wall and discovered a small space containing a tin box. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper bearing just 3 lines of text in faded ink. "My name is Laura Whitaker. They are coming for me. Look in the place where water meets stone." The paper was determined by analysts to date from the appropriate time period, but no record exists of whether authorities pursued this potential clue. The location referred to as "where water meets stone" has been variously interpreted as the riverbank where Laura's boot was found, the stone bridge that once spanned the Blackstone River near the mill, or perhaps a well or cistern that might have existed on the property. Local historians and amateur sleuths have occasionally attempted to revive interest in the case over the years. In 2002, a graduate student at Boston University wrote a thesis examining the Laura Whitaker disappearance through the lens of women's rights and economic power in late 19th century New England. The paper suggested that Laura's true transgression was not merely uncovering financial improprieties, but daring to assert authority in male-dominated spheres of business and law. a challenge to social order that certain men found more threatening than the exposure of their crimes. The students' research uncovered tax records indicating that in the months following Laura's disappearance, several of the mill's board members, including Edwin Porter and the then-retired Dr. Reynolds, made substantial property purchases and investments that would have required significant capital, potentially the diverted funds that Laura had discovered and documented. These financial movements lend credibility to the embezzlement scheme described in Laura's recovered notebook. A descendant of Harriet Blackwood, cleaning out a family attic in 2010, discovered a small leather case containing what appeared to be personal effects salvaged from the Whitaker mansion. Among these items was a silver hairbrush with the initials LW engraved on the handle, a tortoiseshell hair comb, and, most intriguingly, a small key with an unusual double-toothed design, potentially the key mentioned in Laura's journal that had so disturbed Edwin Porter when she spoke of it. The key was tested against various locks in surviving structures from the appropriate time period in Millfield, but no matching mechanism was found. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the old mill site and the Whitaker property revealed no hidden chambers or buried objects that might have been secured by such a key. Its purpose, like so many aspects of the Laura Whitaker case, remains tantalizingly unclear. Perhaps the most compelling theory regarding Laura's fate emerged from a series of interviews conducted in 1965 with Agnes Sullivan, the elderly daughter of a former mill worker. According to Sullivan, her father had often spoken of the widow who knew too much, and claimed to have helped her escape from Millfield on the night of her supposed disappearance. This account suggests Laura may have staged her own vanishing act after realizing her life was in danger, using the boot found by the river months later as a deliberate misdirection. Sullivan claimed her father had arranged for a carriage to take Laura to a train station in a neighboring town, where she boarded using a false name and papers prepared by a sympathetic clerk at the county records office. If true, this would identify Sullivan's father as the mysterious Mr. Sullivan, referenced in Laura's correspondence with her Boston attorney. However, Agnes Sullivan was in her 80s when she provided this account, and no supporting documentation has ever been found to verify her claims. The textile industry in New England declined sharply in the mid-20th century, with many mills closing as production moved south and eventually overseas. The corporate descendants of the Whitaker Mill ceased operations entirely in 1974. During the liquidation of company assets, a substantial collection of business records dating back to the 1890s was donated to the Massachusetts State Archives. Researchers examining these materials discovered several ledgers with pages carefully removed, pages corresponding to the time periods and financial transactions Laura had highlighted in her documented investigations. In a curious postscript, the final surviving member of the Porter family, Edwin's great-grandson, committed suicide in 1985 after experiencing financial difficulties. Among his personal effects was found an envelope containing newspaper clippings about Laura Whitaker's disappearance and a handwritten note that read simply, "Family fortunes built on quicksand eventually sink." Whether this referred to knowledge of his ancestors' crimes or merely expressed a poetic sentiment about the family's declining wealth remains open to interpretation. The Whitaker case exemplifies how effectively truth can be buried when sufficient power, money, and social convention align against it. A woman who dared to investigate financial crimes and question the authority of respected men was easily dismissed as mentally unstable. Her disappearance conveniently attributed to her supposed fragility rather than to the very real threat she posed to those whose crimes she had uncovered. In this sense, the story of Laura Whitaker transcends its specific historical moment to illuminate patterns that persist today. The silencing of inconvenient voices, the protection of powerful interests, and the dismissal of women who step beyond socially prescribed roles, these themes resonate across time, making this century-old mystery feel uncomfortably relevant to contemporary observers. For those interested in the psychological aspects of the case, the most disturbing element may be the calculated way in which Laura's credibility was undermined before she was removed from the scene. Dr. Reynolds's treatments served a dual purpose. They mimicked symptoms of mental instability through arsenic poisoning, while simultaneously providing a pretext for dismissing her accusations as delusions. It was a perfect trap. The more she insisted something was wrong, the more evidence accumulated of her deteriorating mental state. Former residents of the apartments created within the Whitaker mansion during the mid-20th century reported consistent experiences that defy conventional explanation. Multiple tenants described the sensation of being followed when climbing the stairs to the third floor. Several mentioned waking to find their belongings subtly rearranged. Most commonly reported was the sound of someone writing, the scratch of pen on paper, emanating from vacant rooms, particularly during the early morning hours when fog from the river enveloped the property. One tenant, a graduate student in history who occupied an apartment in the converted mansion from 1962 to 1964, became so fascinated by these occurrences that she began researching the building's past. Her inquiry led her to the Whitaker case and ultimately to correspondence with the few remaining individuals who had known Harriet Blackwood in her later years. Through these connections, she learned of a rumor that Blackwood had maintained a hidden archive of materials related to Laura's disappearance, documents considered too sensitive or potentially libelous to include in her official papers. This hidden collection, if it exists, has never been located. The student's own research notes mysteriously disappeared from her apartment in the spring of 1964, shortly after she had approached the current mill owners with questions about their corporate archives. She abandoned both her research and the apartment shortly thereafter, leaving Millfield abruptly before completing her degree. Attempts by subsequent researchers to contact her have been unsuccessful. The shopping center that now occupies the former mill site has experienced an unusually high turnover rate among its security staff, particularly those assigned to night shifts. Former guards speak of inexplicable cold spots, electronic equipment that malfunctions without apparent cause, and the distinct impression of being watched from empty corners. Several have reported hearing a woman's voice whispering just at the edge of audibility, seemingly reciting numbers or names that they cannot quite distinguish. In 2015, a restoration project at the Millfield Public Library uncovered a cache of documents that had been concealed within a wall cavity during renovations in the early 1900s. Among these papers was a letter signed by Laura Whitaker and dated October 15, 1895, just 2 days before her reported disappearance. Addressed to a Mr. J., presumably Jonathan Hayes, her Boston attorney, the letter stated, "I have secured the evidence where none will think to look. The key I mentioned is not merely a key to a physical lock, but to the entire scheme. Porter suspects I know more than I have revealed. Reynolds watches me constantly under the pretense of medical concern. I fear my time grows short. Should I disappear? Do not believe any explanation they offer. Look to the water and stone. Truth, like the river, finds its way around obstacles." Forensic analysis confirmed the letter's age and the handwriting as consistent with Laura's known documents, but the paper had suffered water damage that rendered portions illegible. The reference to water and stone echoes the note discovered in 1997, suggesting a consistent hiding place that Laura had identified for crucial evidence. However, the precise location indicated by this clue remains elusive. The final enigmatic detail in this century-old mystery comes from an unexpected source. In 2018, a local medium who had never previously been involved with or expressed interest in the Whitaker case claimed to have received repeated messages during meditation sessions. These communications allegedly consisted of a sequence of numbers and a single phrase, "Third floor, north corner, beneath the Nightingale." While such claims would typically be dismissed by serious investigators, the sequence of numbers matched a banking code used by the Millfield Savings and Loan in the 1890s, information not readily available to the public. The nightingale reference might indicate a decorative element or piece of furniture in Thomas Whitaker's third-floor study, a room Laura had reportedly avoided due to the severe headaches she experienced there. Whether this represents an actual psychic communication, a remarkable coincidence, or an elaborate hoax based on obscure historical research remains an open question. Visitors to Millfield today will find few obvious reminders of Laura Whitaker. Her name does not appear on historical markers or in tourist brochures. The grand Victorian mansion where she lived has been demolished, replaced by modern condominiums. The ancient oak tree that once stood in her garden was removed in 2020 after being deemed a safety hazard following storm damage. Physical traces of her existence have been systematically erased from the landscape, yet something of her story persists in local consciousness. Parents warn children not to linger near the river when fog descends. Residents living near the former mill site report dreams of a woman searching through endless rooms, opening drawers and cabinets with increasing urgency. And occasionally someone claims to glimpse a figure in period dress standing beside the stone bridge at dusk, looking intently into the dark waters below. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Laura Whitaker case lies not in its unsolved mysteries, but in its demonstration of how effectively truth can be buried when those seeking it lack sufficient power to withstand opposition. Laura challenged the economic and social hierarchies of her time, and those hierarchies responded with ruthless efficiency to remove the threat she posed. In the absence of definitive answers, the case of Laura Whitaker has become a kind of psychological Rorschach test. Those inclined toward supernatural explanations see in it evidence of restless spirits and unfinished business. Skeptics find a cautionary tale about mental illness and the dangers of obsession. Feminist scholars identify a narrative of patriarchal suppression and erasure. Conspiracy theorists detect the fingerprints of powerful cabals protecting their interests across generations. The truth, as Laura herself might have observed, likely lies somewhere in the documented evidence rather than in our preferred narratives. What seems most certain is that a woman who sought justice disappeared under suspicious circumstances, while those she accused of wrongdoing prospered in her absence. The rest, whether she was murdered, institutionalized, or managed to escape, remains conjecture, each possibility opening onto its own disturbing implications about power, justice, and the fragility of truth in the face of determined opposition. And on particularly quiet nights, staff at the shopping center, built over the foundations of the old mill, sometimes report hearing what sounds like scratching coming from inside the walls, soft but persistent, like someone trying very hard to get out. Maintenance checks reveal nothing, and the sounds are attributed to old pipes or settling concrete. But those who have heard it describe an unsettling sensation that accompanies the sound, a feeling of being watched by eyes filled with urgent purpose and terrible knowledge. Perhaps some truths refuse to remain buried, returning again and again to the places where they were first suppressed, waiting for someone who will finally listen. Or perhaps, like Laura Whitaker herself, they simply vanish into history, leaving behind only questions that echo unanswered through the years.